about to give is the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth to help you God.
I do.
Mr. Welles, do you have counsel with you?
I've asked Mr. Norman Littell, Mr. Chairman, to act as my counsel in view of the many questions involving the immigration laws.
I showed you a photostatic copy which was furnished us by the Department of State. Dated January 11th, the White House, addressed Dear Sumner, and signed Eleanor Roosevelt. Is that the letter you referred to?
That is the letter, yes.
Chairman, I'd like to read this letter into the record. I believe that this said that the Labor Department did not examine the case carefully enough. Why not do it all over again and bring it out in the open and let the Eislers defend themselves? Cordially, Eleanor Roosevelt. Mr. Welles, do you recall examining the material which Mrs. Roosevelt transmitted with her letter of January the 11th?
I remember that when this... As I've already explained, in view of the organization of the Department of State, the highest authority to whom I could refer these questions in the Department of State would have been the Assistant Secretary of State in charge of the administration of the department, which included, of course, the visa section. And these papers were consequently transmitted by me to Mr. Messersmith, since I knew that the fullest possible consideration would be given to them and that every proper precaution would be taken in their regard.
Now, these papers were brought to her by a perfectly honest person who was very much disturbed.
The only way I can give you that information now, of course, is through what I assume is hindsight, since later papers would seem to indicate that these papers were brought or left with Mrs. Roosevelt by a gentleman called Mr. Donald Stevens, I think is the name.
Can you further identify Mr. Stevens?
I'm afraid not. I find here in the file a letter which he addressed to me some weeks later, but so far as I know, I never replied to that letter, and further correspondence with that gentleman was held by other officials in the department.
In the files of the State Department, is it not possible under the law to have a hearing in New York or Washington in which these charges could be preferred in the Eisler? Mr. Eisler was inadmissible at the time he applied for a non-quota visa in Havana, Cuba in 1939?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a statement of 1 or 2 sentences in reply to that question, with your permission. It's very easy, Mr. Chairman, for officials of this government, or ex-officials of this government, to be accused of negligence or dereliction on account of hindsight. It is perfectly obvious that if some of the facts that have now been brought out by this committee had been in my possession at this time, the action which I took would probably have been more far-reaching and more careful. But I want also to make this point, Mr. Chairman. At the time of which we are speaking, the atrocities that had been committed in Germany